A warm welcome to today's talk. It's Saturday the 2nd of October. Now, I'm getting a lot of questions about the vaccine mandates in the United States and whether people that have had the infection naturally should still be mandated to be vaccinated, because after all, if you've had the infection, do you need the additional immunity? So basically, I'm going to use the evidence to answer that question today. That's kind of the aim of today. And then I'll leave you with a bit of a decision to make at the end. Probably more of an ethical decision, to be quite honest, than a scientific decision. But let's look at the evidence here. So post-vaccine and natural immunity is the question. Now, we know we get immunity after infection, of course, and we know we get immunity after vaccination. Now, let's start off by looking at some US data. Now, this was of the 11th of December, around about when the vaccination programme started in the United States. So US data as of the 11th of December. Now, 11th of December, it was estimated that 91 million people had had the infection, therefore would develop some degree of immunity to the infection, of course, because they have had it. 77 million estimated symptomatic illnesses in the United States, and 3.4 million people had been hospitalised. So that kind of gives you the rough percentages there, doesn't it? We can see about, well, over 4% of people are being hospitalised, and 3/4 of people or more have symptomatic infection from that American data. Now, moving on, US natural infection, February 2020 to May 2021. Now, this is the latest data I can find from the official American sites up to the end of May, but of course that misses out a lot of the Delta surge, so these numbers are going to be lower than the actual figures now, but we'll look at them anyway. So 0 to 17-year-olds, 26.8 million had been infected out of 73 million in the entire demographic. 18 to 49-year-olds, 60.5% had been infected. 50 to 64-year-olds, 20.4% have been infected, and 65 plus 12.3% have been infected. And here we have the percentages of the population. So this is the total number of people in the demographic: 73 million, 138 million, 62 million, 54 million, 65 plus. And this is the total number over 120 million, or the estimates there are actually about 103 million to about 140 million who had actually had the infection. They settled on about 120 million out of a total population in the United States of 328 million, based on the 2019 data that is the latest that's available. So 37% of the population had already been infected at that point. And of course, now after the Delta surge, what can we add to that? Can we add 5%? Probably at least. Can we add 10% because of the Delta surge? We don't really know. We don't have the latest data on that yet. But it does show that there was a lot of natural infection in the United States as of the 11th of May, end of May, 2021. Now let's look at the first research paper that sheds light on this. Immunological memory to SARS coronavirus 2 assessed up to 8 months after infection. This is published in the journal Science. Not a huge study. They started off with 254 and they got long-term follow-up on only 51. But it's a peer-reviewed article, so it's worth talking about. Antibodies against SARS coronavirus 2 spike and receptor binding domain declined moderately over 8 months. So the antibodies did go down over the 8-month period of this study, but only moderately. But memory B cells, now the memory B cells is the memory for the cells that actually make the antibodies. So it's the B cells, the B lymphocytes, that actually produce. These are the factories for the antibodies, or the immunoglobulins. They actually produce the antibodies. And if you have a cell that remembers exactly how to make the correct antibody, this can duplicate very, very quickly, preventing future symptomatic infections very often. So memory B cells against SARS coronavirus 2 that make the antibodies for the spike protein at least, increased between 1 month and 8 months after infection. So these actually carried on increasing. Interesting. Increasing. Proportion of subjects proportion of subjects positive for CD4 cells. Now, these are the lymphocytes that are called the helper cells. So these CD4 cells stimulate the B cells. The CD4 T cells are the helper cells that stimulate the B cells to make the antibodies. So this is the T cell here, the CD4 cell with the CD4 receptor stimulates the B cells to make the antibodies. And the proportion of subjects positive for CD4 cells, T cells, remained high at 6 to 8 months after infection. So again, looking pretty good for the longer term immunity here. And they say the different types of immunomemory each had distinct kinetics, resulting in a complex interrelationship over time. Now, what the kinetics means here is the kinetics means the way that the human body interacts with the immunity that is being generated. So in other words, they're saying B cells have one characteristic, T cells have another characteristic. And of course, another group of cells, the T CD8 plus cells, the cytotoxic cells, are also very important in this infection because they kill whole infected cells. So what did this study conclude? Well, fairly firm conclusions, really. Substantial immune memory is generated after COVID-19. So they're certainly going down in that camp, aren't they? About 95% of subjects retained immunity at about 6 months after infection, but for longer as well. Is it going to last for 18 months? We don't know yet. And this is important because people get so tied up on the antibodies. And they say this, circulating antibody titers, that's the amount that you titrate, you work out the amount of the antibodies, were not predictive of T memory cells. So the antibodies, really, a bit of a red herring, really. Just to focus on antibodies is naive at best, really. But the Centres for Disease Control are taking a different stance because they want everyone vaccinated, whether they have had the infection or not. And this is where the argument is originating. And of course, it's become politicised in the States. We tend to get right-wing parties that are very strong advocates of natural immunity and allowing people not to be vaccinated if they've had natural immunity. Sometimes the more left-wing advocates in the States are more for vaccinating everyone. It's a pity it's become politicised. But let's see what the Centres for Disease Control is saying. Well, they're still recommending full vaccination for all, and especially with the official approval now of the Pfizer vaccine, this is resulting in the mandates. This is where the vaccine mandates have come from. So basically, a lot of organisations in the States are mandating vaccines now, with government, central government approval. They're mandating vaccines whether someone's had the infection or not. This is the crunch of the debate. And we will come to a conclusion on this. Just hang on a minute. The immune response for vaccine is more predictable, the CDC is saying. That's a direct quote. So basically they're saying natural immunity, well, you might get immunity, you might not get immunity. Vaccines, more predictable. That's what they're saying. We're going to consider if that's true or not. Antibody responses after infection vary widely by individuals. Well, yeah, the antibody responses do. We'll accept that. But does it matter? Does it matter? Given that circulating antibody titers were not predictive of T memory cells. We believe that to be true scientifically from analysing the blood samples. So does this matter? Probably less so than that would intimate. FDA Administration Centre for Biologics Evaluation Research. Now, I've put the link here. I'll show you in a minute. You can watch the people actually saying this. We do know that that immunity after vaccine is better than immunity after natural infection. Well, I mean, that's on that YouTube video there. I'll show you the link in a minute. I mean, do watch it. But that is a pretty bold statement. They're actually saying that immunity after vaccination is better than immunity after natural infection. Now, that is questionable. That is questionable. In fact, we're going to conclude that it's probably wrong. Not to put too fine a point on it, but that's what FDA was saying just at the end of June, I think this was. Generally, the immunity after natural infection tends to wane after about 90 days. Well, not really, according to this paper here. That is not what this is really saying, I'm afraid. So, again, really quite why they're coming out so strongly for this particular position is rather difficult to justify, as I understand the science. Heck, they probably got better science than me, but if they have, I'm not quite sure what it is. It appears from the literature that natural infection provides immunity. Well, they concede that point, we agree. But that immunity is seemingly not as strong and may not be as long-lasting as that provided by the vaccines. Well, pretty strong statements, and I don't see that these are consistent with the science, to be quite honest, but that's what they're saying. I mean, just to think of one theoretical point of science, we know that the vaccines are going to produce an immune response against two antigens, in the spike protein and the receptor binding domain, whereas natural infection will produce an immune response and antibodies and memory B cells and memory T cells against 20 different epitopes, 20 different antigens, 20 different proteins that the immune system recognises as being foreign. So quite how they can justify that statement is rather difficult for me to see, actually. I don't quite get that. I think, there you go. Basically, you can see I don't agree with that. Inconsistent with the UK as well. The UK COVID pass guidelines for international travel and such like. Proof of natural immunity. This is a direct quote from the government website. A proof of natural immunity shown by a positive PCR test result for COVID-19 lasting for 180 days after the date of the positive test. So they're saying you're good for 6 months. Basically, they're saying you can be considered to be fully immune for 6 months after natural infection. So we see really clear blue water between the US position and the United Kingdom position here. Next paper, protection of previous SARS coronavirus 2 infection is similar to that of Pfizer vaccine protection, a 3-month nationwide experience from Israel. So this is large-scale whole community data from Israel. Not a study, it's actually, it's okay, it's in this peer-reviewed, not peer-reviewed, sorry, take that back, it's not peer-reviewed, it's a preprint paper, but it comes from Israeli government data, direct from Israeli government data, which is a reliable source, I believe. Vaccination, this is what that paper says, vaccination was highly effective, so preventing infection at that time, 92.8%, protecting against hospitalisation, 94.2%. Severe illness 94.4% and deaths 93.7%. So they're the levels of protection from the vaccine. Now we do know that this is declining now over time, and we do know that these actually decline somewhat over time. So this declines most over time. This declines less, this declines less, and this declines less still. But they are still declining over time, we now know. But let's look at the same time when this data was collected, the protection from prior SARS coronavirus 2 infection. So protection from prior infection. Now this is based on quite a large sample size, about 500,000 people who were infected but not vaccinated. And they estimate that it was that the protection they get against new infection is 94.8. So we see that's higher, a little bit higher than that. So how the CDC can say that this number's higher than that number is inconsistent with the Israeli. That number there is higher than that number is inconsistent with the Israeli data. We see that the protection against infection by the Israeli data is slightly better if you've had the natural infection as opposed to the vaccine, and that's before there was vaccine waning effects. Hospitalisation, 94.1% as opposed to 94.2%, so essentially the same. Okay, the vaccine's 0.1 ahead, but it's basically the same. Severe illness protection after the vaccine, 94.4. Severe illness protection after the infection, 96.4. So again, we see that in these two instances at least, the natural infection is providing more protection, even in people that are unvaccinated, compared to vaccination. So there we go. The Israeli data seems inconsistent there with the CDC thinking. Ministry of Health, again in Israel, during the summer surge, 5th of July to the 3rd of August, was the Delta surge, of course, over 500,000 people were infected but not vaccinated. So again, they had this good sample size. So 500,000 people had the infection but were unvaccinated, so they can compare those. And just 1% of weekly new cases were in people who'd previously had COVID-19. So that indicates really that the effectiveness of the vaccine is more like the effectiveness of the natural infection is more like 99%. To be fair, that I already said nearly 95%, but it looks like it's even better than that. And also, and this is remarkably encouraging, it shows that previous infection is protecting against the Delta variant. Just 1% of weekly cases were in people who previously had COVID-19, who'd had the infection, but were not vaccinated. So we see a high level of protection with people who've had the infection, but were not vaccinated. Now, we believe that people that have had the infection and have had at least one dose of vaccine have even higher levels of protection than that. But this is still showing those good levels of protection from natural infection. This is the guy who's been crunching the data for the Israeli government, Israeli Institute of Technology. These numbers look very low, we agree. The data suggests that the recovered have better protection than people who were vaccinated. So this data is suggesting the opposite of what the CDC seems to be saying at the moment. So that's the data from Israel. I'll leave you to decide which you think is the more reliable. Systemic side effects were more common in people that previously vaccinated. So here we're on a kind of a risk-benefit analysis, aren't we? There's your kind of seesaw and there's your plank on it. So it's a risk-benefit balance, isn't it? So if there's more likely to be side effects, that's a bit of a downside, isn't it, against not vaccinating people quickly who've had the infection. There's a large-scale UK study. In fact, this is based on tens of thousands of people. This is the COVID symptom tracker, the Zoe data, actually. So people who've had the Oxford vaccine, 1.6 times more likely to get a reaction or systemic side effects after the first dose of the Oxford vaccine, but people who'd had the Pfizer vaccine, nearly 3 times more likely to get nasty or systemic, not necessarily nasty, but systemic side effects. And people that had been previously infected and then vaccinated, 50% more likely to experience severe side effects that required hospital care. So this data would seem to indicate that giving people 1 or 2 doses of vaccine, at least shortly after natural infection, is associated with a greater risk. So where does this leave us? I think the debate here is public health strategy versus individualised medicine. So I think the thinking of the FDA and the CDC in the States is they want the whole population to become as immune as possible, and they want the kind of treating everyone the same. Whereas the traditional approach of medicine is to look at people individually. So if you go and see a GP or physician, they'll look at you as an individual, whereas community health people tend to look at populations. And this is the kind of tension we're seeing between that. So ideally, every individual would have a blood test. Every individual will have their antibody levels tested to see if they've had natural infection. Every individual will have their B and T cell levels checked to see if they need a booster dose of vaccine. Then if the B and T immune cells were relatively low, they'd have a booster dose of vaccine. If the B and T immune cells were relatively high, they could postpone having another dose of vaccine. But practically, that is simply not going to happen to over 300 million people in the United States. It is just not going to happen. It's not going to happen to the 64 million or whatever it is, 66 million people who live in the United Kingdom either. It's simply not going to happen. So pragmatically, it seems that governments are saying, well, we need a one-size-fits-all. And I can understand that argument. So you can decide whether that argument is better. It's kind of a utilitarian argument. It's arguing the greatest good for the greatest number. Whereas the individualised bespoke medicine approach would say, well, no, what is right for this particular individual? And let's tailor a bespoke vaccination programme or non-vaccination programme for that particular individual. But given that that's not going to happen, you have to decide which is most appropriate. But the balance of evidence is that people that have had, my conclusion, I've been looking at this most of today, the balance of evidence is that people that have had the natural infection have greater levels of immunity than people who had the vaccine alone versus natural infection alone. People that have had natural infection followed by the vaccine have even higher levels. And we don't know yet, but I predict that people that have had the vaccine followed by natural infection will also have even higher levels of immunity. So there we are. It's regardless of the the outcomes from this particular debate, although scientifically I think the debate's probably pretty well over. What we don't know, of course, is the longevity. We do know that the immunity from vaccine-induced immunity is waning. It's looking from provisional data that immunity from natural infection wanes more slowly, but we don't know that yet. But I suspect it will last for several years. Combining that immunity with the vaccine immunity, it's looking good for herd immunity and community immunity, which is partly why we're seeing numbers dropping in the United States, for example, at the moment, at least in part, although there is potential for a final kind of surge, I believe, in autumn. So I think that's the conclusion. Do we want to take a public health strategy versus an individualised medicine strategy? You decide that. But the balance of evidence, as I understand it at the moment, is that natural infection causes a better grade of immunity than vaccination alone. But if you've had both, it's even better. But there are slightly more risk. Well, there is quite a bit more risk of systemic side effects if you've been vaccinated, having had the natural infection. And that's certainly consistent with nursing and medical colleagues I have who've had the vaccine after many were infected at work, and they do seem to be pretty rough for some. Many aren't too well for a couple of days after that. So vaccines are great for generating immunity, but natural infection also great for generating immunity, probably better. The longevity remains to be seen. If the longevity is good, then I'm still hopeful. I'm in a minority of not many here, but I'm still hopeful that this virus can be eradicated after a few seasons, quite a few seasons perhaps, not straight away. It's going to be some time, but still hopeful it can be eradicated, although we are certainly heading into an endemic phase. So I hope that helps resolve the debate. It's not a political opinion, it's just that the balance of the science, I believe at the moment, favours the natural immunity argument being superior, but of course natural immunity and the vaccination is even better. Okay, hope that made sense, and thank you for watching.